In 1875, Karl Marx wrote a letter to the leaders of his own political party. It picked apart their new program clause by clause, calling it confused, hollow, and dangerous to the movement he had spent his life building. The party did not publish it. The men running it decided the letter was too disruptive to release before a unity Congress, so they sealed it away. For 16 years, it circulated only among a small circle of allies. Marx died in 1883. Only in 1891, 8 years after his death, did his old collaborator Friedrich Engels finally force it into print. By then, the party had already built 16 years of policy on the very program Marx had tried to kill before it was adopted. A generation later, a state that called itself Marxist would treat that same private complaint as if it were a governing blueprint. This is a story about what happens to a person's actual arguments once their name turns into a brand that other people fight over. Today, Marx gets attacked and defended in almost identical terms, both sides certain they are arguing about the same fixed doctrine. Three claims get repeated constantly by critics and supporters alike. That Marx invented the idea that labor creates value. That Marx never said what should replace capitalism. That history already proved him wrong because workers got richer instead of poorer. Each of these claims survives because almost nobody goes back to the actual texts, the actual dates, the actual audience each document was written for. Take the first claim, that Marx invented the labor theory of value. He did not. Adam Smith proposed a version of it in 1776. David Ricardo built a more rigorous version decades before Marx published anything. What Marx actually added was a different question entirely. Ricardo could explain that labor determines value, but he could never fully explain where profit came from without contradicting his own theory. Marx's answer was surplus value. A worker sells their capacity to labor for a wage, and that wage is set by what it costs to keep them alive and working. But the value that labor actually produces in a day exceeds that wage. The gap between what a worker is paid and what a worker produces is where profit lives. Under this account, exploitation is not cheating or theft in any legal sense. It happens even when every transaction is fair, even when the wage is exactly what the market says labor is worth. That is the actual claim, and it is a claim about the structure of exchange, not a slogan about labor being physically stamped into objects like a fingerprint. 20th century readings on both sides of the political spectrum often flatten this into something cruder, treating value as a literal physical substance poured into a product. Critics attack that crude version because it is easy to attack. Some defenders end up defending that same crude version because it is easier to repeat than the original argument. Neither side is arguing with the text Marx actually wrote. Take the second claim, that Marx left no plan for what comes after capitalism. The document that comes closest to a plan is the one this piece opened with, the letter his own party tried to bury. It is usually called the Critique of the Gotha program. Marx wrote it as a private warning to allies before a Congress, not as a manifesto for the public. He was attacking a rival faction's vision of state-run socialism, arguing it compromised too much with the very state power it claimed to oppose. The party leadership suppressed it for exactly that reason, because it was inconvenient timing for unity. It sat unread by most of the movement for 16 years. When Engels finally published it in 1891, it entered the world stripped of the argument it was actually having, and the audience it was actually addressing. Decades later, planners in a state built in Marx's name inherited this private, internal memo as though it were scripture, 2 full generations removed from the argument and the audience it was written for. So the claim that Marx gave no blueprint is wrong. There is a document. But the common assumption that follows, that here is the blueprint, is also wrong. The actual object is a suppressed internal warning about a specific political dispute in 1875 Germany, read later as universal instruction. Take the third claim, that history refuted Marx because workers got richer instead of poorer. This claim depends entirely on which text you are quoting. In the Communist Manifesto, written jointly with Engels in 1848 as a political pamphlet meant to agitate, the language points toward wages being pushed down toward bare survival. That is often called the absolute immiseration thesis. Almost 20 years later, in the mature theoretical work Capital, Marx wrote something narrower and stranger. He argued that in proportion as capital accumulates, the situation of the worker, whether paid well or paid poorly, must grow worse. Read carefully, that line is not primarily a claim about wages at all. It is a claim about a worker's position relative to the growing power of capital, and about alienation from the product of their own labor, regardless of what the paycheck says. Scholars disagree sharply about how to read this shift. Some treat it as Marx quietly abandoning his earlier prediction once he did the deeper economic work. Others go further and argue there was never one single coherent immiseration thesis to defend or refute in the first place. Only a later label applied to two different arguments written 19 years apart. Either way, the popular rebuttal that rising wages disprove Marx is aimed almost entirely at the 1848 pamphlet. It rarely engages the 1967-page argument in Capital at all. Across all three claims, the same mechanism repeats itself. A primary text gets replaced by its institutional afterlife. Cold War textbooks flatten it one way, a suppressed manuscript gets treated as scripture another way, a pamphlet written for agitation gets mistaken for a finished theory. Different institutions do the flattening, defenders and attackers alike, but the shape of the distortion is identical every time. None of this is an argument for or against Marx, or for or against any system built in his name. It is a demonstration that when two sides argue about capitalism versus Marxism as if they were two finished, stable doctrines, they are usually arguing with flattened stand-ins for both. The next time someone tells you what Marx said, the only question worth asking back is, which Marx, which text, which year, published by whom, and for what audience?